Hola, mi gente. Last episode of April. And I wanted to end this month to talk about Black excellence and Black arrogance, uppityness. And I have a question, mi gente. That's a question that I've been asking myself my whole life. How do you behave when you're Black, well born, you know, rich family, somewhat wealthy or very, very wealthy, and you have some talent, you are ambitious, and you are not a terrible person, not a troublemaker? I'm asking that question, Miente, because I was watching the NFL draft. That's the draft for American football. You're selecting the best player. The worst teams select the best players. And there's this young man, Shedeur Sanders. He's the son of Deion Sanders, one of the, best players, football players ever. Great athlete, wide receiver, who's now the coach at Colorado State. And great coach, basically, but brash persona. He always speaks his mind, but he has a great work ethic. And he has a son who's a quarterback and who was in the draft, in the NFL draft. And despite the fact that his son is a good athlete, he's a good quarterback, he falls into the fifth round. That means that he's selected after over 100 people. The question here, Mihende, is not talent, and it's obviously something else. And that's why I wanted to ask this question. How do you behave when you're Black, well born, you have some talent, and you are ambitious, you don't have any red flags, and something like this happens to you? Because obviously something happened. And I was listening, I watched ESPN. That's the um, biggest, sport channel in America. I think it's now, even plays even internationally. I was listening to analysts talking about the fact that he was too arrogant. He's not him, as they would say in American slang, that he's not that all that. And that despite all that fact, he wasn't humble. His dad, Deion Sanders, said that there were some things that they weren't willing to play for, all of those type of things. And I just wondered, man, this is just tough. I'm not saying, Miente, that this is racism. When you talk about race, it's not always just a question of racism of white people. Race, you can be racial without being racist because, as some analysts at ESPN was pointing out, some of the people doing the selecting were African Americans, were Black. So yeah, what was going on here? And that's why I always say that there is um I don't know what in French. I keep saying this thing, so je ne sais quoi, um, with Black people and the way they view themselves. I don't think that when something has to do with race, it's just a white people question. That all that is at issue here is racism. The poor Black men, young men, being a victim of racist owners, racist coaches, or whatever. No, I think there's something bigger at play here. And to see that, mi gente, you have to go to take it away from the American context where you can say it's Black or white and put it in the African context where such things happen all the time, where Black excellence has a smell. Even for Black folk, this is a Black folk issue, where if you're Black and you're too good, you're too brash, people look at you like, man, it's this Kendrick Lamar song. Sit down, be humble. Humble. You can't be too out there. And the quarterback position that Shedeur Sanders plays. It's the most important position on the team. The person who plays quarterback is supposed to be a leader. Is supposed to be very smart. Supposed to know the plays, etc., etc. I'm trying here to make the point that usually when a black person arrogance has to do with something that has to do with intelligence, people have all the trouble in the world with that. They can take the fact that a black person is very good at singing, is very good at dancing, is very good with something physical, sports, even acting. But when he gets past that, when he gets to something that makes money, when he gets to something that has to do with leadership, then it becomes a problem. And then if you're even confident, it becomes viewed as arrogant. It's problematic. People look at you differently, even black people, even Africans. If you are black, well born, you have some talent, and you are ambitious, people are like, yeah, who does she think she is? There's something with black excellence, if it has to do with intelligence, with something intellectual that is not just physical, with some, that just rubs people the wrong way. Not just, white Americans, not just white Europeans, not just others, but even Africans. There's something there where, it has to do with history, niente, where people look at that and say, that is wrong. Why? Who does he think he is? That reminded me of my dad. My dad. I'm gonna keep talking to you about my dad until you become curious. Fitzo Victor. My dad was able to become an industrialist, to become rich because people assumed that he wasn't smart because he spoke French terribly. He couldn't read, he couldn't write. He was able to become a captain of industries in Africa for that reason. People always assumed that he would become their Negro. People always assumed that Fotso Victor would become their Negro. That's why they gave him a chance, because it was like, okay, he's the right guy to put there because obviously he's not very smart. Obviously he's gonna do what we are telling him to do. Obviously it's not gonna work. Obviously he's gonna go very far with all of this. In my dad's case, he worked against the people who made that assumption. And knowing that people were going to make that assumption, my dad used it to become very, very wealthy. Because when he was doing contracts with people from France or, outside of Africa, people always assumed that they could take advantage of him. And they were really, really willing to make a deal with him because they were like, oh, okay, that's good. Yeah, there's no way he can make this contract work to his advantage. So the point here, Miente, is that there's something, I think it has to do with history, with the fact that as Ta-Nehisi Coates, says, it's just not just African Americans who have internalized the way black folk are viewed. People always want Africans, black people, to be their Negro. They have a problem with black excellence when it has to do with the mind, thinking, intelligence, intellectual. And this young man, Shedeur Sanders, he's a quarterback. And because he's Deion Sanders' son, and because he's brash, and because, yes, as to well-to-do kids, he he has trouble not showing that he knows stuff and that he owns stuff. That's very, very typical for any kid born into a well-to-do family who has some talent and who has been able to make some money out of it. That is typical. And Miente, that's very, very American. He's very American. Shedeur Sanders is an American kid. And because he wants to play quarterback, that became a problem. It got personal. And his dad, who's a football player, one of the greatest, that should have worked for him. Because people would have been like, oh, his dad can't help him, survive the NFL. But it worked against him because people looked for trouble where there were none. Yeah, I'm not. I again, the my point here isn't that this is the racist thing, but that this, yeah, it's a racial thing, and that there are too many examples of this everywhere in Africa every day, where people don't want black excellence, especially when it has to do with, you know, intelligence, with, money, managing money, leadership position, to be brash, to be sassy, as even, you know, people in Africa, they're always like, yeah, let's humble him. I heard a lot of analysts talking about that. They were trying to teach him a lesson of humility. Can you imagine how many black folk have had to be taught that lesson? Why? Why is it important for black people when they are good to be humble? When in America, arrogance is a thing where you show off, you show off. Why does it become an issue when it's a black person who is trying to do something that is not just physical? I remember, it was a long time ago. Yeah, time just flies. When the Williams sisters and their dad, Richard Williams, before his daughters had won a tournament, he was saying that Serena and Venus were going to be number one and number two. And people, I remember, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And tennis was a white sport. It was considered not to be a sport where you could just be physical and win. You had to be intelligent I remember at the time, Martina Hingis was the number one player in the world. She was not physical at all. People assumed that she was one of the smartest people out there. She was using all type of tactics. She was a very strategic player, and she used to beat the Williams sister all the time. And people were like, yeah, they have to learn to be humble. They think that tennis is a physical game. Niente, even I've had those type of things said about me. Obviously, I'm my dad's daughter, born in a well-to-do family, wealthy dad, came to America. The issue, interesting, I faced this issue with the Brussels bar. And to me, I kept asking myself that question. How, how, how do you behave if you're black, you're born in a well-to-do family, you have some talent, you have done stuff? How do you behave? People never wanted me to behave as all attorneys, as all other members of the Brussels bar, whether they are foreign lawyers or not, behave. You know stuff. You have done things. You're self-assured, and yeah, you come from a wealthy family. People were always like, "Oh my God, the princess." Be humble. I never got that. I never got that. The number one thing that they wanted me to be was to be humble. And they wanted to humble me. Why? Why does black excellence, when he has to do with something that is not physical, lawyer, a quarterback, something that is not just we can just boom boom, where people can just say, oh yeah, It's normal. It's black, strength. Why do we need black people to be humble when they're good? I'm not even saying great yet, just good. Why? Why is that a problem? Why does sassiness, flashiness problem if it doesn't affect their competence? Why? And miente again, this is not a white question. Even among African, when they see one of their own, somebody who looks like them, being a lawyer, playing like Andre Onana, the goalkeeper in Manchester United, they hope that that person falls because it makes the point that, yeah, history's right. We are this way. There's this need for black folk to just believe that, yeah, humility is the way to go. A young man who behaves like most young American young men who have money and who come from money. Look at the way the Trump kids are behaving. And at least he has some talent. He has done stuff. And here it's a problem. Why? So, Miente, again, if you have answers, let me know. There's no way you win here. It's very, very difficult to win. When people think that you come from wealth, you have some talent, and then you are ambitious, you think that you're smart, you think that you know stuff, you think you have some knowledge, how do you behave? If you don't just say, yeah, why do we want smart, talented, black folks to be Negroes? Why? Why can't competence, talent, excellence, when it is black, speak for itself? Why? That's the question, Miente, that I wanted to ask for this last episode of April. At issue here is how much history matters. It's not to say America racist country. No, this is a black on black thing also. African excellence, it's a problem. Why? Thank you for listening to this episode, and don't forget to share and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you haven't already. See you Thursday midday for another English episode of my podcast.